My name is Maurice Wade. My earliest memory of the library probably goes back to my elementary school days in a small segregated school in Graham, North Carolina. I think it was probably around third grade or so, once we had learned to read a little bit, they took us to the library. That's probably the first time that I encountered a library. The impact of the library in my childhood was, I think, pretty substantial and probably had some role in me becoming an academic and spending 41 years as a college or university professor. I do remember in my early encounters with the library, in that little library in the segregated school, that I was exposed to a world beyond the little narrow world I grew up in, my family and their church, because it was a very religious Pentecostal family, and I didn't know anything of a world beyond that world. And I'd never seen that many books. That was another thing. But exploring those books somewhat gave me a sense of a world beyond my own circumstances and exposed me to ideas beyond those that I sort of grew up with. So I think of the library, even in those very, very, very early days of my exposure to it, as sort of opening the world to me in a way that it hadn't been opened before. And that only sort of increased as my life went on and I had more substantive encounters, bigger libraries. I was a bookish person. I didn't have the luxury of being athletic. I was rather shy, so the opposite sex was there, but sort of unavailable to me because of my shyness. And so I very much looked to the world of books as a place at which I felt at home. And again, I don't know where this came from, but I think I long had a sense, even as a child, and it intensified in adolescence, that I was living in a somewhat constrained world and reading all kinds of things, whether it was factual stuff or fiction or mythology, just gave me this sense of that larger world and made me believe that I could perhaps participate in that larger world. So even in adolescence, maybe even especially in adolescence, in my teenage years, the library, because it had these books that I could have access to for free pretty much any time I wanted them, was a way of having a refuge from the limitations of my particular circumstances. I'm the oldest, and my mother, when I was born, didn't work for a while, and she read to me, so I learned to read pretty early. And she was something of a reader herself, and she was very concerned, I think, as a young mother with being a good parent. And I remember her having these various pamphlets about parenting. And even as a kid, I would read those. So at least in part, the enthusiasm for reading came from my mother introducing me to books. The importance of access had to do with my sort of home life. The main book available in my house was the Bible because it was very, very Pentecostal family. And so if I'd stayed in that limited environment and never had encountered libraries, I wouldn't have had that access to the books that then in turn gave me access to a larger world that taught me that there was a history that I was located in and a part of that existed long before me. There were all kinds of people in that world that were different from me and the people I knew. So access was a profound part, I think, of me becoming who I am. And also, if you're an introverted, shy person, you tend to often be inner-focused. And that inner focus is enriched when you have access to books because you have things to think about other than yourself, other than what's going on right around you. It gave me a much richer internal life. And growing up in a Pentecostal household, the world was a world of a vengeful God who saw everything, and that could provoke a great deal of anxiety in a child and a teenager, especially since you know that you are not living up to the codes. Having something to think about and engage with other than that was really important. Small towns can be everybody knows everybody's business, so there's enormous pressure, sometimes overt, sometimes indirect, to conform. And if you are not someone who's particularly adept at the things that people value, at least among my peers, there were things like being a good athlete. I was poor, so I didn't dress particularly well. And contrary to the stereotype, I didn't have great rhythm, so I wasn't much of a dancer. So again, books, libraries, for people like me, gave us something else. Something to grasp onto, to hold on to, that gave us a sense of accomplishment, enrichment. And even though sometimes being bookish and smart might get you in trouble with your peers for being, these days, it's sometimes called a nerd, it also gave you a little bit of status, too. People did value, even sometimes backhandedly, people valued being smart. And you sometimes got certain kinds of privileges from being smart. You got a certain kind of respect, certainly from adults, certainly from teachers. And if you weren't good at lots of other things, having that sort of respect was important for one's self-respect. You felt like, oh, I'm good at something. And so libraries and books and being a reader and therefore knowing lots of things that perhaps people around you who weren't readers didn't know, again, was a source of some degree of status and some degree of privilege and so some degree of accomplishment. I think there's a basic human desire to be respected. And so having a career that's focused on the life of the mind and having some competence in the life of the mind is a source of respect. So it satisfies a pretty basic human desire. And also, I think, going back to the theme of libraries and books, I think libraries and books taught me, by exposing me to different cultures, different historical periods, different kinds of people, taught me not to be afraid of difference in ways that I might otherwise have been. And sometimes I think disrespect for others comes from a kind of fear, a fear that the way they live negates the way you live, or the way they live denigrates the way you live. And so exposure to a diversity of people, cultures, ideas, institutions, historical periods, et cetera, I think by making me more open to difference than I otherwise would have been, I think also made me more respectful of others. Now, the project of respecting others, I think, is a lifelong project because we all have our insecurities and our worries and the like, and I think those worries and insecurities can fuel disrespect of others. And also, when people respect you, it's easier to respect them. I mean, it's a two-way street. You would think more people would realize that, yes. I think sometimes we think, because self-respect is easier when you're respected, that we have to dominate other people in order to be respected by them. But I think the respect that comes from domination of others is a kind of false respect, because the minute you become weak and you can't dominate, that respect goes away. So you have to find another reason for respecting others than your ability to dominate them. And I think also that's something the books gave me, because even with being introduced to a great diversity of people and cultures, et cetera, you also saw ways in which they were like you. And that helped to develop empathy, I think. You realize they're dealing with what you're dealing with. We're all dealing with certain aspects of the human situation. So you're not alone. And as different as you might be, there's still a kind of common humanity, a common human situation that you share. The Trinity Library played an enormous role in my professional development. I mean, when you're in graduate school, at least in philosophy, you tend to be very, very narrowly focused. And then you write a dissertation where you're very, very narrowly focused. Well, I landed my first academic job, which was at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. And then 3 years after that, I come to Trinity. And I had to teach courses that were beyond the narrow focus of my graduate education. And I was somewhat panicked, I must say. But then I had this library. I remember having up on the third floor in the library a little cubicle of my own, an enclosed cubicle. But my department chair at the time, bless her heart, she's now deceased, got that for me. She said, you're going to need this, you're going to use this. And the cubicle was right across from that section in the stacks that had the philosophy books. So when I was asked to teach, for example, 18th and 19th century history of Western philosophy, I knew some of those figures because I had worked on those figures in graduate school, but there are others I didn't know. So I would go from my little cubicle to the relevant philosophy section, find some books, and take those to that cubicle. And I would study those books, take notes, develop lectures. And so I was learning the things I needed to learn in order to teach my students. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without this library and that cubicle and that really rich philosophy section. And with anything that I wanted to learn as part of my professional development and growth, the library was central. I mean, to be honest, I think a large part of the reason I became an academic was I liked learning. I mean, I just found that enjoyable. And so as profound a resource as the library was to me professionally in terms of my ability to discharge my duties as a professor, the library also was a great source of pleasure because it enabled me to learn and continue to learn. There was a lot of territory that the library enabled me to cover, much of which was utterly unexpected. And there's a kind of joy in discovering something that you didn't know, at least for me. If we can go back for a moment to my teenage years, I mean, I started college as a teenager. Most of us do. And I wasn't well prepared. I grew up in a mostly segregated school system until the last 2 years of my high school. And so I went off to college. I was an undergraduate at Yale. I got really lucky and got in and had a scholarship. But boy, the other students at Yale were way beyond me in terms of what they knew. I'd never even written an essay in my life. And reading essays taught me how to write essays. And so I had to spend a lot of time in the library because that was the way I could get up to speed, at least somewhat. You can catch up if you're willing to put in the work and the time and the energy. And the library is just full of stuff that can get you where you need to be. I certainly wasn't prepared for Yale in terms of what I knew, if you're thinking about content, because my elementary school education prepared me for basically subservience. I mean, it was segregated education. High school was a bit better, but still, I mean, they weren't preparing people to go off and become academics. So I landed at Yale very poorly prepared. But the one thing that libraries had done for me was I knew that there were resources in books, that I could go to the library. I could go to librarians. I could talk to my peers and get their recommendations for things that they were reading. So I wasn't completely overwhelmed by my lack of preparation because I knew there were resources. I remember the very first paper I had to write was in a biology course for non-science majors. And I wrote this long essay, and the grades they gave at the time were pass, high pass, and honors. Those were the 3 grades. The TA who graded my paper gave me a pass, quadruple minus, and said, you need to learn to write a paper. And he was right. I didn't know how to write a paper. I just put a lot of stuff, I read stuff and put it down on paper. So I began to pay attention to how essays and book chapters and things like that were structured. And I began to mimic that. And I also would read papers by my peers who had gotten good grades and see how they were organized. I began to mimic those things. So knowing that the library was there and knowing the kind of resource that it could be for me in those circumstances was really important to my ability not to get completely overwhelmed at a place like Yale. It jerked me out of my little narrow circumstances growing up, and I was meeting people who were very different from me, who had never met someone like me. But again, having had some acquaintance with diversity and difference through books made it easier for me to be open to their difference and even to be open to their lack of knowledge about people like me and being willing to sort of share with them who I was and where I came from. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the transition from small-town Graham, North Carolina to Yale was an easy one. It was very difficult. I remember the first couple of weeks I wrote to my parents and said, I want to come home. But back in those days, it was an instantaneous communication. By the time they wrote back, I was okay. Trinity is right here in the city of Hartford. It's an urban campus. But the fact of the matter is there are young people across the street for whom this is an unknown world. Unfortunately, back in the days when Evan Dobell was president, he got that learning corridor built across the street, and a lot of local kids now go to that school, and a lot of them have access to this campus, and part of that access is access to the library. So the hope is that's one small channel that will open up this library, at least, as a resource beyond the confines of the campus. And some of the young folks out there in the community might see opportunity that they don't see otherwise. I mean, sometimes it can be difficult, though, to take advantage of opportunity because the people you grew up with might see you as abandoning them, as repudiating them, because you're moving on to something else. So it can take, 1, some courage, and 2, it takes some support. Fortunately, I grew up in a family where people viewed education as a pathway to betterment for oneself as an individual, but also during the times of segregation, where Black people were often characterized as ignorant, not able to speak well, not able to think critically. My parents and the community at large saw education as a way to refute that aspect of racism. So that was important to me, sort of seizing the opportunities that learning and libraries as a part of learning provided to me. But I suspect the hold of one's peers and one's family on some of these young people is an impediment because they don't want to lose the support and sense of connection to those peers and their family. And so even if the opportunity is there and they can see it, taking it feels just too risky. As an introverted, shy kid, one of my aspirations in going to college was to understand myself better. And so I set out to be a psychology major. And it Turns out I wasn't very interested in the scientific side of psychology. We had to go into the lab and we're running rats through mazes and things like that. So I took a couple of psychology courses, and a very new major came along at Yale, which was an interdisciplinary major in psychology and philosophy. And so I started taking those courses, and it became clearer and clearer to me that it was the philosophy side that I was interested in. And so that's when I just declared philosophy as my major. And to be honest, I didn't think much about, well, what am I going to do with this degree? People would ask me, and I had no idea. I enjoyed it, so I kept doing it. And I applied to graduate school and got into a decent program, and I kept enjoying it. I had an advisor in graduate school who got me focused and pushed me towards a certain dissertation topic, and then pushed me to get on the market and get my first job, and things sort of fell into place like that. And when I came to Trinity, I had the good fortune of having very good, very supportive colleagues who basically let me do anything in philosophy I wanted to do, teach anything I wanted to teach. So I never felt confined within philosophy to do one thing. I could go where my interest led. The philosopher I worked on in graduate school was David Hume, and I worked on his theory of the emotions. And his thinking has always been really important to me, less his epistemology and more his work on the role of emotion and passion in human life. And he taught me that as rational as we might think we are, we're really creatures of passion and emotion. And passion can be destructive or violent, or passion can be calm and motivating and take the long view. And also one of the things he taught me is learning and reading can help shape passion so that it's calm and enduring and takes the long view rather than being violent and short-sighted and destructive. And that's one of the things in my teaching I tried to get across to students. Because often they think of the life of the mind or rationality as something that's passionless. But if you don't have some sort of passion at work, you have no motivation. But passion is a raw material, you might say. And ideas, thinking critically, being rational can shape that raw material into something substantial. So that's one thing that I think I try to influence students by communicating those ideas. Also, I was, and still am, very much a student of Karl Marx. I mean, he was a man limited to his times, and he didn't get everything right, but his ability to sort of see beyond this capitalist world that we are in, and on the one hand to see all the various achievements this world has brought about, but also see how those achievements are often not made available to everyone, and sometimes are used to exploit many people. I tried to sort of communicate some of Marxist thinking to my students because many of them came from very privileged backgrounds. And I think they had no sense of there being folks who didn't have the resources they had, and no sense in which their own privileges, often through no fault of their own, because we don't choose our families, we don't choose our communities, where we're born, etc., often through no fault of their own, they had lots of resources because of the exploitation of other people. And so through no fault of their own, they were connected to that exploitation. And that connection should matter to them. Now, it's up to them how they address that, but they should at least be aware of it. And to bring it back to libraries, I would point out to students that in the library I learned things about the things I'm teaching you that I couldn't teach you if I didn't have these resources. The world of information technology is a wonderful world, having all of these resources at our fingertips. But one of the great things about the old-fashioned library was you would go to the card catalog, you'd find the book you were looking for, its call number, you go to the stacks and you locate it, and then there are all these other books next to it, and you start pulling some of those off the shelf because they're related. And so you begin to see, wow, here's a perspective on this thing I'm interested in that I didn't know about. Maybe that's a better book than the book I came in here for. So I think I always, in addition to stressing certain philosophical views to students, I also just tried to stress how important it is to be a thinking person and for your thinking to grow and expand. And if you're at a place like Trinity College, which is not the richest college in the nation by any means, but is richer than 95% of them, maybe even 98% of them, take advantage of these resources. I mean, Trinity Library is part of a consortium. We have Trinity, Wesleyan, and Conn. And those three libraries together constitute an enormous resource. So I've always pushed students to take advantage of that resource. Oh, I think imagination is critical to philosophical thought. I mean, part of what philosophical thought is about is thinking outside what's ordinary, realizing that the constraints of the ordinary are powerful constraints, but you can step beyond them. And imagination is critical to that. And imagination is critical to pursuing opportunity. You have to imagine you could do those things. You could be those people. You can occupy those places. So if we can get kids across the street living on Brownell, for example, to imagine that they could be over here on this campus, succeeding, thriving, enjoying, the opportunities presented over here might be real to them. That's kind of funny. You have to imagine certain things before they can become real to you. And sometimes what you imagine might not be something you can achieve, but if you can imagine another possibility, you're not stymied, you're not stuck. You can see, okay, I couldn't do this, but maybe I can do that. If I failed at this, maybe that failure tells me something about who I am and what I can do. So let me imagine another way. I've gotten so much good advice from so many people over the course of my life. It's hard to isolate any one thing. I think one piece of advice that's always stuck with me came from my mother. She stressed to me the importance of humility. Yes, strive. Try to be successful. Try to improve your circumstances. And if you achieve and you have success, don't think you're better than other people. Recognize that as talented as you might be, if you didn't have help along the way, if you didn't have good luck along the way, you wouldn't have been able to do any of that. I guess one of the things I would say to my 10-year-old self is worry less about not fitting in. Don't let the fact that you're different, you're an oddball, you're bookish, create so much anxiety. There's a larger world out there. There are many possibilities out there. And you don't have to fit in right here. Everybody wants to fit in somewhere. But there's likely a place somewhere where you might fit in. To be true to yourself might require not fitting in where you are. And let's say a young person across the street, I guess I'd be kind of specific. I would say, don't think that this campus across the street from you is unavailable to you or someplace like it. You could come here or someplace like this. It might not be a small liberal arts college, but nonetheless, it might be a way of having a life that is better than the one you grew up with. There are times when I beat myself up a little bit because I didn't write the books I wanted to write the articles I wanted to write, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I realize that I live in a house, which is not a palace. It's bigger than the house that any of my ancestors would have lived in. I have an income. It doesn't make me rich, but it's bigger than the income of any of my ancestors, right? I have access to opportunities they never had access to. I've been to places in the world they never heard of. And a lot of that is because I went to college. I went to graduate school. And again, keeping the focus on libraries were critical to that. One of the ways in which I think Trinity has become a different place and a better place is it's become demographically much more diverse, especially in the student body. And we have many more first-generation students than we used to have. And those first-generation students are like you and me. They're stepping into a new world and confronting new possibilities, new opportunities, and they may end up leading lives that no one in their circumstances led. But leading those lives can also become examples to others. For many students, at least during my early years, the mid-'80s and early '90s, I probably had lots of white students who had never seen or encountered a teacher of color. And certainly, if they'd taken any philosophy, they hadn't run into a black man talking about David Hume. And so they were seeing something they'd never seen before. And who knows, that might have exploded some of the stereotypes they had that they didn't even know they had. What advice would I give to libraries and librarians about standing up to the pressure to ban books of one kind or another? I'm not sure I need to give them advice because I think people who work in libraries, by and large, are committed to what they do. I mean, I think librarians are underappreciated. I think those folks have been on the front lines of providing access to ideas, to books, to articles, to film, to all sorts of media by which one might learn things, experience new things. So I'm not sure I would need to advise them. I would say to them, keep on, keep the faith, because there are always going to be folks who are trying to undermine what you're doing. Because power doesn't like critical thinkers. Power doesn't like people who challenge the status quo. And there are going to be people who are critical thinkers and challenge the status quo as long as we have readers. I'm not sure I would need to advise young academics very much about using libraries, because I think one of the things that college education and graduate education do pretty well is get across the importance of libraries and books. I mean, if you take a course, there's going to be assigned articles, there's going to be assigned books, there's going to be a reading list, all of those things that point you to the library. I guess if I was going to say one thing to them, it would be, you're probably an academic because you're enthusiastic about ideas, and you're enthusiastic about the various vehicles that communicate ideas, books, movies, film, music, etc. Communicate that enthusiasm. I think one of the worst things academics do is let's say one is giving a lecture in a class. If that lecture is given in a sort of dry, monotone fashion, it's going to be boring to those folks. But why did you learn that stuff to lecture about it in the first place? Presumably, it turns you on in some way. Communicate that. Be enthusiastic. Be passionate, because people feel that. I didn't realize it was that long. 250 years for the Hartford Public Library. That's fantastic. That's an achievement. That's 50 years before Trinity came into being. First of all, I'm glad to know that it's been around that long, because that means there are people who've been committed to that. It means that there are resources that have been available. And I suspect there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives that have been changed in small and sometimes big and profound ways by the existence of that institution. I hope the Hartford Public Library is around for another 250 years and 250 after that, and on and on and on and on. So I'm enormously pleased to hear they've been around for 250 years. Hartford should be proud. Often people don't see the things about Hartford that are legitimate sources of pride. That should be very high on the list of legitimate sources of pride. A public library that's been around for 250 years. And the legacy, much of it probably is not visible. It's people who have gone on into various professions here, some of them in other parts of the country, some of them in other parts of the world. What they've learned at the library has informed how they educated and raised their kids, the things they've done in their neighborhoods, and on and on and on. So my guess is that 250-year legacy goes far beyond what we might think. I hope, as a consequence of my teaching and student interaction with me, that there are people who developed a greater appreciation for the importance of libraries and who carry that appreciation to others. Well, I'd like my legacy to be, he was a supporter of libraries. He understood what libraries can do for people. He tried to communicate that in both indirect and direct ways, and he had some success at it. That would be fine with me.
Thank you for listening to 250 Stories, a production of HPL Studios at Hartford Public Library. This episode was written and produced by Christopher T. Brown, sound by Sam Sigmund, edited by Faith Lucas, and with photography and graphic design support from Hartford Public Library's communications team and the Hartford History Center. For more information on this project, visit www.hplstudios.hplct.org. New episodes release every Tuesday, so subscribe to stay tuned.